Good afternoon. My name is Marvin Taylor. I'm the director of the Fales Library, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome you this afternoon to the second of our Critical Topics in Food series for 2011. And today's panel is titled From There to Here, Harvesting the Roots of Today's Farming and Artisanal Cookery Through Oral History. We do a series of these programs every year to highlight current topics in food studies. And today is a very special program for us because we're announcing the opening of an oral history project that we've been involved with for the past couple of years. And I'm really honored now to introduce Carol Mandel, who's the Dean of Libraries here, who's going to talk a little bit more about the oral history project. Thank you.
May I?
Thank you, Marvin.
You know, it doesn't go down here.
It doesn't. It does. Sure, it does. Because
Sure.
there's going to be small people here too. So thank you, everyone, for coming. I was going to say for coming in out of the hot into the cool, but with such a great audience, we're generating our own warmth. But we'll stay cool in another way. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be. Had the opportunity to help introduce this panel and event. What we have learned, I think so many of you who are here, from what I've seen of the list, are really knowledgeable about and engaged in the food business in its whole chain and many aspects. And so you know about the Fales Library collections and what it has really done and what we are trying to do. And what we have learned, and we knew this right from the start, but we're learning it more every minute, is that building a collection that supports food studies in all its many aspects and food culture in all its many aspects is really not just about collecting books. And even about collecting books, it's about collecting cookbooks and you know, as primary source material. Yes, I know many of the cookbooks in our collection probably have stains from use on them, but but they won't get any more of those because those are really really primary source material. And what we realize is that the very much 20th century phenomenon that we are starting to document, and that is being seriously studied in new ways and new understanding than it ever has been before. Libraries have just not been up to that kind of collecting. And what that kind of collecting means, as I said, it's not just books and it's not certainly not just published works. It's really about documenting the story. And so many of you are involved in this, and so much of food culture to date, because it hasn't been this big academic topic, is about what we tell each other. And how, what you know, and then what, I mean, it's just the way restaurant tips go around, but it's much more than that. And you know, from farm to table and every aspect, it's all about, and all these small businesses and all about these people contributing. And so part of this is a pitch for your papers, because many of you are involved in that, in creating that story. And we want to help document that story into the future. And it's also why I'm so grateful to Judy for helping us do what we really also need to be doing, which is that oral history needs to be part of how to tell this story. That the folks that are engaged in this are not all out there writing books, and they're not all out there putting everything they know in books. We have to go out there and get it from them, which is what you did. And you did such a good job of that, really. And are we going to be able to see, will people see any of these? Yeah, so they're going to find out about this. So this panel is telling the story. This panel has lots of good stories to tell. You're going to hear about that. And this panel is a wonderful way to celebrate this oral history collection, and voices from the food revolution, people who changed the way America eats. Of course, a lot of people who changed the way America eats are sitting right here. They're sitting right there. And we're so grateful to Judy and to the Leon Levy Foundation that helped us fund this project. Thank you for creating the documentation that so many people will be using. And of course, we're not done. We'll keep right on going. So thanks very much for all of this. This panel, again, will be a real example of what we need to keep telling each other and how we can keep learning from that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Carol. As I usually do with these events, I'd like to give an update on the status of the collections here. And I don't know if many of you saw it, but perhaps you did. The Times in the first week of April announced that we're in the big league now, which we've thought we've been in the big league for a long time. But we have 55,000 books about food in the collection now, making us the largest collection in the country of materials to support food studies. And something miraculous happened recently that propelled us to the largest collection, and that was that Jennifer and George Lang gave their collection of 21,000 volumes to the library. We're a little inundated at this point, but happy to be so. And Jennifer's here today, and I'd like to just ask her to say a couple of words. And please join me in welcoming and thanking Jennifer Lang.
I would like to say how happy I am that our books have come to Fales. Our collection and the Fales Library have gotten married, and Clark was the matchmaker, and Marvin is the officiating minister. So, and it's a fitting thing, and we're really happy that that happened. So I hope in the fall you can come help us celebrate this this match. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And now you've had enough of me, but I'm going to have one more parenthesis. I hope during the exhibition you get a chance to check out our current exhibition that was co-sponsored by the Asian Pacific American Studies program here. It's called Marvels and Monsters, and it documents the images of Asian Pacific Americans in comic books from 1945 to 1985, which was really the height of the comic book trend in the U.S. It's based on the collection of William Wu, who just donated somewhere around 600 comics to us that have depictions of Asian Americans. I think it's a fascinating show, and I hope you enjoy it. These events couldn't take place without our great patron and volunteer and a force of nature, I guess is the best way to describe Clark Wolf. Please join me in welcoming Clark. Thank you.
All right, so here we are. When Marvin and I first started working with Marion Nestle on the development of this library and collecting these wonderful works and magazines and periodicals and recipe cards from Jell-O and all kinds of wonderful things, one of the things we talked about was how important oral history is and was and will always be. And one of the things that we hoped for was that something like this would happen. The idea that the ultimate word-of-mouth person, James Beard, would be a little bit of the focus of this collection is kind of extraordinary. About 15 years ago, a young man who worked for me was and still is the son, redo that sentence for me, of a woman who's an oral historian at Berkeley, at Cal. And they did an oral history project of the San Francisco Bay Area food scene. And it really galled me that there was no repository that was appropriate here in New York City. When Marion Burroughs called me up and said, my friend Judy Weinraub is moving to is spending all of her time in New York and has been working on oral history. She's been a journalist for 25 years and specializing in food for 10 and wants to get involved with this. We began some rather hilarious and wonderful conversations. I want to say very quickly, I cannot tell you how happy I am that some of these conversations and some of these magical people have been captured. Judy was able to meet with and record the late and wonderful Michael Batterberry while he was still with us and completely lucid and full of piss and vinegar. You know, it was wonderful. And she's met with John Farone, who wrote many of James Beard's columns and books with him. There are a number of people here today, actually, who were fortunate enough to be part of this program, this 27 interview program. I was actually one of them, and I was learning things as she was letting me talk. I was remembering stories, and I'm the youngster in the group, I think, just about, yes?
No.
Okay. Judy, here's no $5. All right. There are a few of you in the audience. I'm not going to ask you to identify yourselves by your Twitter account, but I would never do that. But if you are one of the people who actually was interviewed for this project, would you just raise your hand, please? Thank you. All right. Well, yes, thank you. Talk to them afterwards. They know everything. All right. Anyway, so let's begin. We're going to talk about the relationship of the oral transfer from person to person. And obviously, to begin with, we're going to talk with Judy Weinraub. And it says Judith, but we call her Judy.
My mother was confused as well.
Your mother was confused. Okay. First of all, please welcome Judy Weinraub. Come on, let's do it. Okay. All right. First and foremost, tell us a little bit about, you started in this program, and I think it's kind of interesting for us to hear how the process of being a food journalist and how the process of being a food-directed oral historian were similar, and how are they different?
Well, I mean, first of all, this is picky, but I wasn't a food journalist. I was a journalist.
Thank you.
And so what that really means is that you, to me anyway, is that there's a wide scope of interest to what you're thinking about and looking into. And in terms of this project, well, let me back up a little bit and say the point of any oral history project is really to throw light on a larger historical subject.
Great.
It has an academic and a real life meaning. In this case, what we have witnessed is an enormous food revolution of the past 35 years, which I was to a certain extent writing about as a reporter. But so much has happened that we really don't even remember. I mean, to use just a very small example, I mean, big in scope, but 10 years ago, I don't think anybody would have gotten too excited about the Farm Bill. Many people didn't really know what it was.
Right.
In the last Farm Bill, there were enormous numbers of panels. Marion led many of them. I mean, all kinds of things that we didn't know there was a food system. We certainly didn't know there was a broken food system.
Yeah.
And so all of these things had to do with, especially because I was working for the Washington Post, they had to do with the kinds of things that fell within my bailiwick. But when you're working as a journalist, you simply don't have time, space, any of those things to let people tell their own stories and how they related to these larger pictures. And that's really what this is about. This is letting people tell their own stories as it relates to this enormous food revolution.
So we can't get away from you without asking, can you give us kind of an example of the experience of one of these conversations? How many times you met, how long it was, what the process was? Because I think that you know that not only will the audio recordings be available, but also transcripts will be available when the time comes that they're all up, all 27 are up. But I think it would be interesting for people to have a kind of a sense, because I have an image of my experience sitting in your living room and having you ask me questions that I don't think you would ask me over coffee or cocktails, and then listening in a way that I'm not used to experiencing with a journalist.
Well, looking at you, I think I better go to you. Is that okay? That's fine. That's okay. Because actually, in one of my conversations with Marion, there was a fire drill. That is really not the kind of thing that you ordinarily experience in an interview. Marion has done so many things, but she really was responsible for establishing food studies as a legitimate course of study in universities. And I don't think you'd had an opportunity to really go through the drill on that. And as I think you said to me when we first spoke, no one you're interviewed all the time, but really on point usually, and no one had been able to take the time to talk to you about your own personal history, your science background, your personal background, and how all of that emerged into your career. Maybe because of the fire drill, we spoke 3 times. It's a little disconcerting, but you were used to it. But I think
I seem to remember a tape recorder malfunction too.
There were always tape recorder malfunctions. But with most people, there were, I guess, 2. There was a tape recorder malfunction with Betty as well in the beginning, and we also met 3 times. But you know, people's lives are long and rich, and 3 times is really nothing.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. It's just a little bit of a capsule. And again, before we even go further, and we'll go back to you periodically through this conversation, but thank you again for getting it done.
Thank you.
All right. Remember, every time you applaud, I realize that it makes things warm, but it also moves the air around, so that's good too. Yes, exactly. All right, so we wanted to continue the conversation, and I fell in love with some wonderful preserves that we have for you to taste afterwards. They're in a little tiny jar. And sometimes something that intense ought to be in a little tiny jar. And it's called Anarchy in a jar, which may be the perfect oxymoron because there's such symmetry and harmony in it. This is a woman who makes preserves from things that are seasonal and local and regional, and who learned it a little bit at the Family Knee. Please welcome Laena McCarthy. So Put your face close to that. Yeah, this is an oral history. This is being archived.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about being a jam maker in 2011, in the context of what's going on in food in America and in New York City, and why the heck you're doing that.
Well, I think that's part of what I am doing, and I think it's a core of what my business is about harking back to the tradition. So my jam, I think, is unique in the way that it uses very much a tradition of American jam making, which I would say often comes from very much farm-sourced, seasonal, and often kind of very simple jams. Often what you see at a farm stand is like, strawberry jam, raspberry jam, very simple, kind of basic, and really responding to the environment it's coming from, and as a way of literally preserving what's being grown in those regions. And the European tradition, I would say, is they tend to be, make much more complex, interesting technique. Often the technique in Europe is a long maceration. So fruit is it's a long multi-day process, and it just has a certain different flavor compound. It's often a little looser. And so I would say that I tend to kind of combine those things. I take some of that old world, but I also try to do unique flavors that I think speak more to especially an urban palate, things that are familiar to people that hark back to things like a strawberry balsamic, which is a very classic flavor combination. It's used often in recipes. It's obviously a classic Italian dessert. It's strawberries with a little balsamic vinegar, and just that flavor works well as a jam. It's slightly unique to people, but it's also not. It's something that you're used to.
It's very much of this time,
Yeah.
isn't it? Where did you
Yes.
learn to make jam?
I
What
learned
got you?
from my mother. I grew up upstate in Woodstock, New York. So I learned from her, and she learned from her family. And so it was something that we did every summer. And she was a landscaper and a gardener, so she really kind of taught me about herbs and growing them and combining them in flavor combinations. And that was something we did a lot together. And then I started doing it as an adult. And did it every summer. It was a hobby for years, and it became kind of an obsession, and then developed into a business.
Well, I want to ask you about the size of the jar.
Yeah.
Because it looks like caviar. That's the size it is, and I really love that because it's not just a preserve. It seems to suggest that it's precious.
Yeah, and I think it's also
In a good way, in a good
urban,
way.
in a sense that I like to think of it as both something that, jam, in most of our lives, we may have it on our toaster and our yogurt in the morning, but I don't know that it's something that we need to be eating a lot of. It should
Okay.
be eaten in a small amount that's savored. Certainly every day I would love it if people had jam for every single meal, and they can. I often suggest to people ways to combine it that are unique. Putting it in their grilled cheese or mixing it in their cocktails. But I think that in that small size, it does kind of remind people that it is still sugar. I mean, it's sugar. It's not. It's definitely not like a health food in that way.
Yeah, excuse me, I love this. Isn't that the most modern take on old-fashioned jam making you have ever heard in your life? That's quite wonderful.
But it's also urban in the sense I think especially in cities, we have small refrigerators. Yeah. Our lives are fast. Many of us, I certainly, admit to having those jars of jam that are large and kind of hide in the back of the fridge forever, and they just live there, and it's because many of us, you collect them, but it's such a large size and it's intimidating, it'll go bad. And so, and the fruit I use, the technique, I don't use preservatives, obviously, it's just the natural preservation process.
How many of you make this jam? How many of you?
It's me, and then I have basically one assistant. So it's definitely still artisanal in that it's small batches, and that's kind of something I like about it.
Yep.
Also, it's definitely something that's manufactured in New York City. I don't have it sent to a co-packer, which is a classic thing that many people, I think, traditional, especially canning companies would do.
And it's interesting. I don't like the word produced when it comes to food, but I don't mind hearing her say manufactured in Manhattan. I kind of like the idea of it. Thank you, Laena. We'll talk to you a little bit more, and you're going to lead the tasting out back, okay, a little bit later. Let's thank Laena. A little oral history there. All right, and next to Laena, arriving late because he was making sure that all the plants were not being burned on top of roofs everywhere, is Ben Flanner, who is an urban farmer and the head of Brooklyn Grange. Welcome, Ben. You made it. All right, put your face in the microphone and tell us a little bit about growing things on roofs and where you learned to grow things, and how you guys share stories about how to sell it.
Sure. So my name's Ben Flanner. I'm the head farmer at the Brooklyn Grange. It's a 40,000 square foot rooftop farm.
Love that.
It's a green roof covering an entire roof of a large industrial building, and we put lightweight soil across the entire thing, and we signed a 10-year lease, and we grow plants in basically every inch available.
Where'd you learn?
I learned by reading books, by hanging out with other farmers.
Yeah.
Also, I used to garden with my mom when I was young in Wisconsin.
Where in
Used to
Wisconsin?
grow a lot. I grew up outside of Milwaukee. We had a decent-sized vegetable garden.
And how many people work at the Grange?
I'm the only full-time salaried farmer. I also have several partners, and we have a crew of interns.
So did you take any formal classes in farming?
No. I've gone to workshops at NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farmers Association, and I've devoured books by very methodical organic farmers.
That's very important. They're very articulate, and some of them are pretty good writers. Do you write?
I don't write too much.
Do you have a journal?
All right. Yeah, right here.
See, farmer journal, right?
It's
Okay.
mostly hash marks and notes.
That's all right. We're going to look you up on the intranets sometime soon. All right, thanks, Ben. We're going to talk to you a little bit more in a minute.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, now we're going to go from the jam maker and the farmer to the educator, but a different kind of educator. Will Wooten is the president of Sterling College, an extraordinary school in Vermont, Craftsbury Common, that is a sustainable ag school, among other things, where they actually teach about farming and growing and earth and land, but they also do it out back. Please welcome Will Wooten. Will, you can applaud.
I'm
So,
here.
Will, tell us a little bit about how, it's a formalized oral history. Basically, you're not just teaching, you're actually doing things out there together, yes?
Yes. Sterling, which is, I'm not sure how many people in this room, but I think you might outnumber our students by 4 or 5. It's the smallest residential college in the U.S. with about 100 students. And it also operates, and I think this is critical, when you start talking about food and food systems, it operates year-round in 3 semesters, one of those semesters being, of course, in the summer. These are traditions. It's been a baccalaureate college for only 12 years, but the traditions of the place go back about 40 years. And those traditions are everyone works on the farm, and every student does farm chores twice a year for a week. Some of these students do not want to do that. But if you're going to eat the food, because about 20% of the food that we eat at the college comes from our own hands, and most of the other stuff comes from the region of Craftsbury Common in what's called the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, an intense farming region, which includes things like North America's largest cheese cave, that if you can get into it is one of the most amazing things, and a very safe thing if it were back in the 60s and we feared attack. That's where I would go, with a lot of bread.
And red wine.
And good wine. And wine, we make mead and good beer. But the college is unusual, I think, in that it is a 4-year liberal arts college. I don't think that Sterling, in its philosophy and how it teaches sustainable farming, is going to save the world. But I do think that the model of the college and how it addresses the education in an undergraduate setting, sometime, I'm not sure when, private or independent colleges gave up teaching farming and agriculture and turned it over to the land-grant institutions. And the effect of that you see in big ag. You also see the effect of that in the outreach of these institutions, which keep so many thousands of farmers informed and knowledgeable about what they're supposed to be doing and what resources there are in the state and how they spur things like NOFA. So there is a relationship between huge farms and very small, sustainable and organic farms in places like northern Vermont, where you might not think they belong, but they most certainly do. So I think in some ways, if there's a revolution going on, it's a combination of somebody figuring out the economic viability of small farms, and I consider small farms farms that generate under $100,000 gross a year. In other words, a family might be able to actually live on it. And cooperative redevelopment of rural food systems, because it doesn't do any good to be a farmer like that if you can't travel a very short distance and sell all your product. So that's the way we approach what's going on in farming. We live it as much as we possibly can. It's a beautiful place to be because you can look outside often and see the draft horses going by. We actually teach draft horse management. I think it's just us, and University of Michigan has a program as well, I'll tell you. But it's this combination of undergraduate education. I think undergraduate college, I think a liberal arts education to farming has an important role in the future. And I wish other private independent colleges like, what would agriculture look like today if all the Ivies and potted Ivies were turning out people who were thinking about food and food systems and not too much replicating always what their fathers and their grandfathers did.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. That's a wonderful statement. What's interesting is I was on a panel in northern Sonoma County last week with a leadership council, all business leaders from the community. And the guy from the Farm Bureau was there, and he was talking about how farmers learn really slowly. They change their minds really slowly. And I thought about it, and I realized, no, post-war, a lot of farmers learn faster than anybody living or dead, because if a cloud's coming, they know what to do. They know how to take care of the animals. They know how to listen to the earth. They know how to move things in a different way. I mean, you have to, right? There's no choice. What happened was after World War II, farmers took a long time learning how to buy chemicals and listen to the agribusiness company and disassociate themselves from the reality of the situation. And the one thing they didn't have is getting together and talking. And I'm doing something in California called a farm forum. We get about this many people together in somebody's backyard 3 times a year. All of the people talk about what they're doing, and at the end of it, the world changes because we don't have back fences anymore. And the idea that you're formalizing that kind of back fence, jumping back a little bit and getting them out into it is really kind of wonderful. You're doing a special program in the summer with food, with cooking. Now, I mean, you've been in agriculture school, but now you're doing something in the middle of the summer with cooking as well. Tell us about that.
I think what happened at Sterling was when you get deeper and deeper into teaching agriculture, you get deeper and deeper into your rural and local food systems, as I mentioned before. That area of northern Vermont is chock-a-block full of entrepreneurs. So you throw a stick and you're going to hit someone trying to develop a new cheese or a new way of farming or a specialized crop or a new distribution system. So we put together a program. We got a hold of an old inn, which had its own kitchen, of course, and some bedrooms, and a tennis court, which isn't developed yet, but will be, I hope. And decided to put a program that had to do with making food from a chef, our chef, and we spent a year finding the perfect teaching chef, to thinking about food and talking and visiting the kinds of farms and cheese caves that I talked about just a second ago. And then we're running this is a 10-week academic program, undergraduate level. And then we have a seminar in food entrepreneurism, where not only do we listen to entrepreneurs who have succeeded, but we have a professor in there to keep them under control, so everyone learns something. And we have but the way you suggest it is really it's a conversation. It's a conversation. It's a guided conversation. It's not too much. I know enough of these entrepreneurs. If you just ask them to talk, they will, and they're so it's good to have an academic in there controlling things, I think. And another seminar in food systems. In food literature, which I thought was going to be classic food literature, and it turns out to be very modern food literature, which I'm not that familiar with. But, and then visiting a lot of farms, shadowing our farmers, and cooking for the college twice a week, which is, of course, one of the better parts of it. Although I will point out that Sterling probably has the best food of any college campus that I've ever been at.
Thank you, Will. All right, we'll come back to you in a moment. Thank you. All right, so Dr. Nestle, Marion, you've watched the pyramid become a plate. You know, you've looked at food from all sides now. When we first met, your goal was to food up the nutrition department. You turned out to kind of food up the world, which is good because it's the most important thing. And you got to watch this, and in the meantime became a sociologist part of the time in your teaching, and an advice columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle when people have difficult challenges about their nutritional confusions. I'm teasing a little bit, but the point is that you do address a lot of issues. I want you to just take a look at what just went on and talk about how you find things today and how you find the kinds of conversations that I remember you and I had and very few other people had. I remember you told me that that a group of people going to the Mediterranean kind of changed a little bit of your thinking because you were spending time with them and seeing these things and tasting these things. And you began to have all these really one-on-one conversations or more intense conversations with interesting people that changed your very disciplined academic mind about how to go about offering this. Give us a little perspective from your point of view.
Yes, Will, your food is the best food I've ever had at a college. It's amazing. It's true. I started out with teaching nutrition, and it never occurred to me that agriculture had anything to do with that. I mean, I look back on it now, but I remember very clearly thinking, you know, agriculture was about food production. It wasn't very interesting, and nutrition was about making people healthy, and it was interesting, and that was kind of the way I thought about it. And in the first class that I taught, was an undergraduate class at Brandeis University, I suddenly found myself unable to answer any question about what people were eating without understanding how the agricultural system worked. And right from the beginning, that class brought agriculture, food, nutrition, and health into kind of the same way. And now it's such a complete blur that all of my classes are connected, and I'm actually teaching a course on the Farm Bill in the fall, which is the hot new topic. When I think back on what we did here at NYU, I had been traveling with a group called Old Ways Preservation and Exchange Trust that brought chefs, academics, and food writers together on boondoggle trips to fabulous places. And I was meeting all these really interesting food writers who kept telling me, we wish we knew more about food. We don't know enough about food. We don't know where the history is. We don't know what to read. We don't know how to go about finding it out. We wish we could go to school and find somebody to teach us these things. And in our department, which was then called, if I remember correctly, Nutrition, Food, and Hotel Management, of all things, the hotel management program was being taken away from us. We had an enormous vacuum that needed to be filled, and I suggested with Clark's, out of discussions with Clark, that we start something in food studies. The dean allowed us to do that, and when I think back of it, that was 1996, which was 100 years ago.
Yes.
In the food movement.
Yeah.
It was 100 years ago. It never occurred to me that we were starting something where we would find out 15 years later that every week there's another university that's opening up a food studies program or its equivalent. We had a doctoral program in food studies that started in 1996. We told our students that they would never teach at an academic institution because they weren't in a discipline that academic institutions harbored, and that they should think about something else and some other reason why they were getting a doctorate. And all of them are teaching in universities now, every single one of them, except for the one who's the vice president of the James Beard Foundation.
Right.
So it never occurred to us at the time that we were starting something, I will say in our favor, that we could see it coming.
Yeah.
That we could see that there was a real hunger, if that's the right word, for information about food that was rigorously based and more rigorously based than had been available. Lots of people had lots of funny ideas about what food history was about, but hadn't really done serious research. And now there's so much research going on that it is truly impossible to keep up with. There's so many books coming out on it. And many of these are very personal and tell very personal stories. And what strikes me so much about it is that because this is so new, it's only 15 or 20 years, that we lost the opportunity to talk to a lot of people who were the forerunners of this about how they had done it. Why did James Beard do what he was doing when it was so much ahead of his time?
You know, it's interesting. You bring this all up, and I remember very vividly, we formed an advisory committee, and we had a couple of meetings where we all talked about what we wish we had information about, and how we wanted to have it, and how it might work. I mean, it was advisory, and we wanted to see each other. And there's a fellow who just came out with the notion that, we know this, that we can only really have about 150 friends, not just on Facebook, but in general. And it was interesting because I used to joke that the food world was about 100 or 200 people in the whole world, and they used to talk to each other. Now, there's a fellow who's writing a play about the summer of 1970 when Julia Child and James Beard and Richard Olney and MFK, they all got together in the south of France to decide who they were going to be when they grew up. It really happened. It was in November of that year, I think. There's a gentleman who's writing a play about James Beard, and he's talking to everybody now still living who knew James or worked around him. Thank heavens that Judy was starting to do those pieces similarly as well. There's a fellow who's doing a major new approved biography of Julia. There is an intense hunger, and it's all being done, as you say, one-to-one, people sharing stories with each other. So what do you think it bodes?
Oh, I think
What do you think it'll have? What do you think this brings us to? What do you think?
what it brings is just more and more and more and more. I look at it as an avalanche. I feel like there's an avalanche behind us of interest and passion and fascination with food and its meaning for society. And, you know, from the standpoint, I write about food politics, and so I'm interested in the political aspects of it. And for me, it seems obvious that it's a place where young people can make a difference, that you can have young people decide to get involved in something about food. They can make a real difference in somebody's life. And I have lots and lots of examples of people who are making a difference just all on their own, trying to do something in a sense where people feel powerless about politics. They feel like corporations have taken over everything. You can vote with your fork every single time you eat something, and that is going to make a difference in changing the way our food systems work. And I think that is so exciting and so attractive for people. And you get to eat it for dinner. But, you know, that lots of people want to be in it, and more power to them. There's plenty to do.
All right, you have little cards, and you can ask a question if you write it down and pass it up. But I'm going to start by asking some questions to all the people of the panel.
Let me echo that 1996 date, if that's...
I'm sorry?
You want to verify that you actually heard her tell you this before?
No, I mean...
Go ahead.
No, I mean,
No,
you
teasing.
mentioned 1996.
That's when our program started.
Right, and I just want to say
NYU.
that 1996 was when I moved at the Washington Post into the food section, and some of my colleagues thought, you are really out of your mind, because, you know, I've been writing
Yes.
all kinds of, you know, interesting profiles in arts and culture and Lord knows what else. But, well, of course, then it just immediately grew. But I want to say that, first of all, I had an opportunity to do far more interesting things because all of the food studies went in so many different directions. And if you go from that moment when there were food sections at newspapers, but not a lot of other places, to the number of people trying to make a living writing about food these days, it is extraordinary.
All right, so we get overwhelmed with Yelp and all the rest of the kind of business, but actually don't. I don't need to go find out who's doing a bad job at food. I only want to know good things. So Judy, and I'm going to ask each one of you, if you had a chance, now write your questions and start passing them down. And Norbert, start walking around and collecting if anybody has them. Judy, if you could have, and in your case, I'll give you 3. Give us a couple of people that you didn't get a chance to talk to, living or not, that you really wish you could have had in your oral history project to sit down and talk for 2 or 3 hours just about food. And all of you, I want to, and it can be somebody nobody's ever heard of. You know, it could be your cousin Phil. It can be somebody that is very important. Judy.
Well, there's a man in Washington whose name is Jim Crawford. Now, this was more or less New York-based, but Jim Crawford was he was a Washington type, and he was in the Navy. And at one point, he and his wife Moy got a little distressed, I guess, with just Washington life, and he moved to South Central Pennsylvania, where he started to organize a co-op of among the some Amish farmers, the farmers who were fairly unsophisticated about how you actually sold your product. So he organized them so that they weren't all growing tomatoes at one time and peaches at one time and things like that. And it started bringing a truck full of these incredibly wonderful products from South Central Pennsylvania to Washington every week. My children will attest to the fact that they were forced to go to this truck. Now they would happily do it. but he changed the eating habits really of,
wow.
I have to say upper middle class,
Yeah, but-
people in Washington
all right,
very
well,
early on.
I love the fact that it's very specific to Judy and to her family, right? It's not, I really wish I could have had dinner with Julia Child, right? Which is, some of us were probably thinking that, no, it's the guy who brought the kids tomatoes, which I think is
Well, but
wonderful.
it's crucial
It's
because
wonderful.
he then became a model for farmers markets and co-ops all over the United States. And also for farmers who brought their product to restaurants all over the United States. And he was very early on. He just happened to be an extremely good organizer. And he's
discovered-
kind of taciturn guy, so it's hard to get it out of him.
I was going to say, and discovered Amish with extra tomatoes. Laena, give us somebody who you wish you could sit down and talk to about whatever you do. And it could be somebody that you've had in your life or not.
Well, I would definitely like to invite into my kitchen certainly my great-grandfather and grandmother, who were both Italian and had a long tradition in their family of, they had a lot of land in Italy, and they did a lot of preserving, and they were, they had their own distilleries, and they were very actively involved, and they just had, methods and techniques.
But
and
you
I'm
said
sure
grandfather
stories.
first.
My great-grandfather and
grandmother.
It's true
No.
because his knowledge of food was a lot more passed down through the oral history of my family. So I would say that, but I also think that my great-grandmother, I'm sure, had lots of things to say. She might not have just been saying them as loudly as he was, but I think that both of them had interesting experiences. I certainly would love to know those things. I never had a chance to talk to them about.
Wonderful. So in other words, you'd like to see your grandmother without your grandfather in the room.
Sure,
Okay.
yeah.
Ben, if you could talk to anybody, Thomas Jefferson, I didn't want to, who would you talk to?
Mine's a bit of a collective, only because I don't have a lot of specific names on it, but it's basically the farmers that survived through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s as small farmers. Not the ones that had a lot of family money to rely on, but the ones that survived as the industrial farming took over. And there's a wealth to learn from them in terms of how resourceful they were and how creative and hardworking they were. And they definitely have set a model. So I have managed to meet a few of these such people, but as a collective group, you can hardly meet enough of them.
That's really good to know that they're out there. Will, I'll put it a slightly different way. If you could have anybody come to lecture at the college about food and farming from history that does or does not exist.
I'm not going to answer that one. It would be you.
Oh, no.
I want to answer the other one.
Okay, go ahead.
Is that right?
Yeah, sure.
Because there are two people I'd want to bring into my house and talk to about food. One is a guy named Hans Imboden, who I worked for, and he ran a French restaurant in southern Vermont called the Silver Skates for probably 25 years. And he was born and raised in Switzerland on a farm, and that's where he learned everything about food until he started being trained in what he called the awful system of European chefery. And then he came to the United States as a baker and worked for another fellow, and then took over this restaurant. And he was both the most interesting man because of his background and terrifying in his own way about how his attitudes about food were and his value. A slaughtering technique I don't even want to go into.
Yeah.
But absolutely riveting guy and I never had the chance, because I was always making me scrub and chop and things. I never had the chance to actually talk to him. I'd want to.
Okay.
And the other people I'd like to talk to, which I don't get to do as a college president, in any constructive way, are these young people I run into every day and watch every day. And politics excluded, I would like to talk to them about food and why they're doing what they're doing and how they're connecting agriculture and food. Their first reaction is often political,
Yeah.
right? And I'd rather be talking, but what about the tomatoes, right? And what about the animals? And that kind of thing. It wasn't too long ago, 2 weeks ago, that Sterling students brought 9 goats to Manhattan.
Yeah.
And a marvelous story about learning how to sell goats and learning it ended up this way, barbecuing goats on the side of the street with firemen and cops in the Bronx. That's another
And
story.
I just want to make sure they started the fire, right? No, I'm teasing.
They just asked
That's
the
quite
fellow.
wonderful. That's it. I hope that it will be a new reality television show soon. No, well, but actually, Marion, I want to Go ahead. A couple of people that you'd like to meet or spend some time with.
I'm struck by how personal all of this is,
Yeah.
and I have exactly the same reaction to that question. Is I would like to interview my partner's mother, who died many, many years ago, who was a farm woman in Illinois who raised 8 children on a family farm that had no cash economy, no electricity. And served meals 3 times a day to a minimum of 10 people. Had to do all the laundry, the baking, and everything else. And the only thing that they ever bought was flour. And she bartered eggs for it. I kind of want to know how she did that.
You know,
Seems overwhelming.
yeah.
And it's what everybody wanted to get away from. And now people want to get back to it.
Well,
They have
yeah.
electricity, which helps.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
But that brings us to another topic, and I want to ask everybody. There is this notion that we're falling in love with these old foodways. The good news is, of course, we can use the family SUV to get somewhere, right? We could put the dishwasher on and the clothes washer on, so we can choose to dry farm and grind the tomatoes and cook them down. Or I mean, we can make these choices. What are the other foodways going down the line with everybody? Because this is a kind of a transposition of a question here. What are the other foodways that you'd love to hear more about, that you'd love to hear more documented by people that actually did them? But Judy, you talked about a person organizing the Amish to deliver tomatoes.
Food way, meaning,
You-
what I mean is the people who produce them, or?
I leave that to you. It can be any part of the food experience.
Okay. I have very good food habits, but they're not perfect. And occasionally I can be found at Chirping Chicken, which does have pretty fabulous chicken. And
Take that out of the archive with no sponsorships, no sponsorship.
A couple of weeks ago, I was standing there next to a really enormous but really fit cop who had crossed the park. Wherever he was, his precinct was, it wasn't anywhere near Chirping Chicken. And he was waiting really, really patiently for his order, which was kind of perfect. I mean, it was lamb and salad and pilaf, and I don't think he had donuts for breakfast. I don't know. But here was this. I mean, it was just really, really interesting because, you know, you don't think of people like that as having had their food, the way they eat, changed dramatically. But this just struck me as something that was extremely important to him, that he wanted to eat a proper meal,
Right.
and he would wait for it, and that was that.
Laena, what other kinds of food folk would you like to be able to talk to besides Grandma and Grandpa?
Many. I mean, I think being a young food entrepreneur in New York City is interesting because there was kind of about 2 years ago when I started my company, many people started to have, it was a simultaneous explosion that happened. We didn't know each other, but of course we met each other very quickly, and we've all very much used each other to learn how to run our businesses, calling each other, okay, wait, my jars are doing this weird thing, why? And, just passing along information and learning from each other. But in some ways, one thing that I miss is many of us have, we've definitely approached, I would say, more older, experienced people who do canning and pickles and jam and things like that. And ask them for advice. Many of them are not as willing to share. Yeah. I don't think it's because they think of us as necessarily competition. I think it's more of this, a bit of an idea that you need to learn it yourself. There's some of that out there, I think. I don't know, that's my interpretation of it. But I think
That's really interesting.
I would love to hang out and talk to more of the old folks who are a little quieter and not as open, and who it takes, I actually think part of it is it takes sitting down with someone and really talking to them for people to trust you and to be open, and that just takes time. And maybe it does take experience. Maybe they'll be more open now that they see that I've been doing it for a while.
And maybe you'll do it with young people when it's your turn.
That's right. Yeah.
Ben, who would you like to spend time with? I mean, obviously you're a farmer, so you're going to spend time with other farmers, but would you like to know more about the people that use your food? Would you like to be able to spend more time with the people who buy your food? What would?
Yeah, it's a good question. One thing that I find interesting is I sell to a lot of restaurants and a lot of chefs, and have quite a few conversations with them about how they use the product, what they look for. Different chefs have different types of qualities that they look for in the product, and one thing that I've come to respect a lot when I speak with them, and it's just kind of a vibe you get from different chefs, is the concept of waste nothing. You have certain. Yeah, I sold some carrots to a guy last year, and he told me about the carrot top pesto that he made. And then served. I don't know if it was even with them or with potatoes or something like that. And a lot of people don't eat carrot tops. A lot do, but I can definitely bet that 99% of carrot tops in a restaurant are thrown into the garbage and probably not composted. So that's sort of a genre of people that I've really come to appreciate are people in the kitchen that are really creative about wasting nothing and using scraps of vegetables. And I think the same thing applies for meat too.
Will, other groups of people you'd like to spend time with?
Yes, I think the people, they're probably not very interesting people, but
Well, we'll be the judge of that.
in northern Vermont, in the local towns, with the big cheese cave I told you about, in a place called Hardwick, organic seed company, and now a new food venture center that they're trying to occupy. And this idea of rural food systems, these condensed, so almost like watersheds, you can almost think of them as. I want to speak to more economists. I want to help people find out how to get to that $100,000 mark and whether these kinds of farms, and particularly CSA farming, which I think is revolutionary but has all kinds of problems with it. I want those kinds of studies in these definable geographic areas. And in the little bit of work that, in the few people I know who are interested, I know more people who are not interested, like the University of Vermont, for instance, is not interested. And others are not interested. And I'm interested, and I'd like to talk to them if they're out there.
It's interesting because the New York Times a couple of weeks ago did a piece in the business section about how the only sector in the economy that was stable throughout this last recession in Europe was organics. And that actually there are venture capitalists wanting to put money into something stable. Good food, what a concept, right? So you're not alone in that. Marion, who would you like to spend more time with?
Oh, I think this is Marvin's fault because I promised to write an essay for him on the history of nutrition books as part of the book that is getting
We'll
worked
talk about
on
that in a minute,
here.
yeah.
And so I've just written a book about calories, and I wish I had known Wilbur Atwater, who died in 1907, and was the person who kind of did all the work on calories. And I'm kind of curious about Adele Davis because she was such an enormous influence on my mother's generation.
Yeah.
And many of us were raised eating, according to Adele Davis, not very happily, I might add. So I would like to go and meet all of those original nutrition people who were kind of moving from food to nutrition. Why did they do that? I want to get back to food.
All right, and we have a couple more questions. I have to tell you, I have to warn you that, and happily tell you that the gentleman who created the TV Food Network is in the hood, is in the room. And so I have to ask you all, television, food shows, cooking shows, farming shows, gardening shows, things on television, which is a kind of an oral and visual history, has it, obviously we're all going to have our opinions about each piece of it, but as a whole, Judy, what's your response?
What's the question?
What do you think? What do you think of it? Is it oral history? Is it useful? Is it just part of the noise or the avalanche that Marion has been talking about? What's its role in your mind?
Well, I have to say, I do think it's part of the noise, but all that said, it certainly, and certain programs more than others, present things that we would never have had a chance to see. Jacques Pepin's knife skills, learn about Lydia Bastianich's little hot spot in the middle of her pan.
There it is now.
Yeah,
yes.
hang on, just
It's Lydia's hotspot. Yeah.
1 second here. But on the downside, one of the last people that I interviewed was Tom Colicchio.
Yeah.
And he as the head chef judge on Top Chef, he has to be the country's best known chef. There's no question about that. And I asked him, how that's affected his life, and he wasn't in any way complaining, but he has now become public property. People come up to him and touch him, and want to have their pictures taken with him, and movie stars approach him and want to be on Top Chef, and he didn't know how to read all that. I don't know how to read all that, but it is certainly out there as something rather astounding.
All right, so Laena and Ben, jump in together if you want, or separately. How does this affect your generation? Do you guys even watch television? And do people talk to you and say, I saw this rutabaga on TV last night, you have to grow me one on your roof?
We don't have a TV.
We don't.
But
what about you, Lou, or your telephone? Or
no, I was just gonna say that I think it's good if it gets people off. If it gets people to pick up a knife, as you said, and try a new recipe, or definitely do something new, or experiment and do a new type of food from something that they saw on TV. At the same time, I think the media's obsession with bacon and gluttonous meat eating is getting a bit tiresome.
Laena, you want to add to that? Yeah, you can applaud if you want to. You're allowed. All the vegans on the left side. No.
I mean, I think I obviously I agree, but I think food shows are good in certain ways that they expose people to things and ideas, and they expose a broad group of people to maybe some ideas of food and creativity, and maybe inspire them to be creative and bring those ideas into their own lives. I also worry, though, a little that I think sometimes that there's a lot of passive consumption in terms of food television, as opposed to active education. Those are just very different things, and I think I don't know actually how much they are one or the other. And I definitely think there's a certain obsession. I would say, at least I have not watched a whole lot of food television, so I'm not an expert. But in what I've watched, I think there is a lot of focus on cakes and meat and a lot of unhealthy cooking. And I've rarely seen TV food shows that really focus on understanding food and ingredients and nutrition and making things that taste good, or maybe thinking about a vegetable in a different way than you might have thought about it before.
I think we have an opportunity in front of us, folks. Right? Start your own show. Will, tell us. I know you get no cell reception in your part of Vermont. And is there cable television, or
Not really.
Do your kids talk about it?
I watched Julia Child as a child, but I don't watch TV yet. I'm really out of my.
Do any of your students talk about having? You can applaud that too. So vegan television? No. Sorry. No. Is it ever in the part of the conversation?
Not around the people I know.
Okay. Sums up. Marion, you have to comment about this.
This is so interesting because none of us watch it.
Yeah.
None of us do. I mean, it's outside our cultural environment. And I was actually on the Food Channel its first week. I did 5 segments, and then I was fired. But that was my introduction to it. I never saw the segments. I don't know what they were like. But I once asked somebody who had a cooking show on the channel what it was that gripped mass attention, because obviously millions and millions of Americans watch it. And she said, cooking shows don't have any calories. This is exactly your point about passive eating. They don't have any calories, but I think they're enormously important for the mass of Americans who don't have this intellectual interest in food. This is their introduction to food, and I have to say that many, many, many students who come into our food studies program have as their goal in life to have a cooking show or some kind of show on television.
I work with a school garden out in California, and the kids start from kindergarten, K through 8. And they grow, when we started, 3% of the kids went through the school garden. Now 100% of the kids do. They just gave the Gardener of the Year an apron with the name of her own cooking show on it. Somebody wanted to grow up to be Rachel Ray, and then she found out what that would mean. And it was different than what she wanted, because they started to do the recipes that they were getting on television with the foods that they grew in the garden. It didn't make any sense. Nothing came in a box, and nothing came in a can, and nothing came, with it kind of, so it didn't connect. So we're about to see either a change in what's communicated on television, or something else has got to go on, but it's all a process, isn't it?
I don't know if this is happening elsewhere, but I know in our area of Vermont there are, and maybe it's all of Vermont, there are these junior, sort of fourth, fifth, sixth grade junior Iron Chef contests, and they get them together and they get a recipe, and then they all take a limited number of cooking devices to a big gymnasium, and they do their thing. 100 different or 30 different groups of children, and their teachers are there, and some of the faculty at Sterling got involved, and we had one student, 2 students go once, and they didn't have anyone to do it, and they had to be the judges. 30 tastes from 30 different groups of adolescent children. It was a horrible experience. But obviously from that contest thing, these are children from rural families who are not eating well necessarily, and they're getting into eating. They were making bean burgers.
They're cooking.
They're cooking.
They're cooking.
And they loved it.
It's interesting because many years ago, James Beard was a judge at a chili contest, and his problem was that he didn't think any of them were any good. And so he had to announce that. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, they're all lousy." And I wonder if it would not be better to have James Beard taste these things and tell us rather than, have to taste them all ourselves. Judy, I know you wanted to make a comment, but I also want to know, who do you listen to on a regular basis? I want to know from all of you, who do you listen to on a regular basis when you make decisions for yourself and your family about food?
Whoever I'm cooking for.
Oh, all right. Okay. All right.
Let me just mention one other thing about that. The most poignant thing I've ever heard about food television was a story about a woman who was dying of breast cancer. And as she lay there months, the only thing that she could stand was watching food television. It somehow had a nurturing quality to it, a feeding quality that, Lord knows what way, enriched her life. And I found that really very touching.
Very moving. Laena, where do you get your information now when you decide to go out, if you take a rare evening off or you decide to go to a market to get something? Who do you listen to about food in your life? Get close to the mic.
Maybe by insinuating that we don't have television, that we are hermits, but I think that one thing, the reason that Ben and I don't watch a whole lot of television is we're really busy, but we're also very active with other people. And I think one of the things that I would say influences both of us in our lives and our business is just that we have a lot of really wonderful and interesting friends who are doing great things, and they're cooks or they're food writers, and they're working for Green Market, and they're doing a lot of things with food.
So you really have a foodist tribe, kind of.
Yeah. So it is. Yeah, it's a tribe. It's a very open, welcoming tribe. But it's we don't do too much raids, and But but at the same time, and so I think they inform a lot of because it's when you're involved in that, it's exciting. As someone will bring you a cool vegetable they just got, or they'll tell you about somewhere they just had this wonderful meal, and I tend to. That is what informs me.
Have you figured out that they're a couple? How many of you figured that out? You get to have a glass of wine afterwards. All right, that's great. Ben, who do you listen to besides the tribes?
The tribes, and I guess all the people I sell vegetables to. For me, just to bring it back to farming again. I do 2 markets a week, and we keep an eye on what people are purchasing, and speak with a lot of chefs, and we also have a 25-person CSA from our farm. So I try to aggregate information from all those different people, especially if I'm planning out my crop plan for the next year or something like that, because especially in the urban environment, we definitely have to make sure that we're staying on top of all our crops and growing wise things.
Will, who are you listening to these days about what to eat next?
Pretty much when I run across something, either at someone's home or in a restaurant, I'm pretty unabashed saying, "What was that, and how did you make it like that?" And sometimes I learned how to make a Greek soup. I think they lied to me. It was awful. So I'm a little bit more like that, sort of when people have something.
In the course of your experience and of your life.
Yeah.
Marion, what about you?
Restaurants or individuals.
Great. Marion, what about you?
Oh, I read the 25 and under column in the Times. And if I'm going to be spending more than that, I ask Mitchell Davis.
That's a very good notion.
Mitchell Davis is the vice president of the James Beard Foundation, is a graduate of our department, and I've known him for a long time.
The gentleman, Marvin Taylor, who you saw, where's Marvin? Are you here somewhere? I know you're in the back. Yeah, you're waving. Marvin is not here this semester because he's on sabbatical. He's doing a book that I'm helping with Rizzoli, called 101 great cookbooks, a 20th century treasury. We're doing a collection of books with an amazing advisory committee. And one of the things that's happened is we wanted, because of the editor's request, to have recipes from each of those books that were relevant. And so what we have is a master's student doing a very formal study to find out which 3 recipes from each of those books historically has been utilized, has been mentioned, has been repeated, and we're using lots of different source material. And it's really interesting how 3 or 4 or 5 recipes rise out of every single book very, very naturally. And we've gotten on the phone and started to talk to people, and we say, what are those recipes that you use from Julia's? Oh, I use the cassoulet. Oh, I use the beef bourguignon. It's very common knowledge. It's amazing that process has continued. We may have to call the book From Fanny Farmer to Thomas Keller, the way things are going, because we're learning a lot from chefs these days. Last question for all of you, and then we'll go in the next room and celebrate and have a glass of wine and have some wonderful food and some jam. It's there. So tell us a little bit about the role of the professional chef, I guess, as a teacher. Were there very many professional chefs in the group, Judy?
I think 5 maybe. I think they all certainly, the people they taught were and also learned from were the people who worked for them and with them.
Yeah.
I mean, learned from in terms of whatever cultural heritage the person working for these chefs brought to the kitchen. I'm not quite sure I know what you mean.
So the chefs, were any of those chefs inspiring to you, or what are the chefs that you want to learn from? What is the impact of the professional chef on the ways we eat and cook these days, in your experience?
You know, I'm not sure. And after all, as it turns out, professional chefs don't cook. You know, I mean,
I was hoping somebody would admit that.
No, they do. They don't. I mean, they certainly, advise and consent, but they don't cook. Last night, I went to hear Claudia Roden speak, and she's obviously not a professional chef, but a very well-known cookbook writer. And she's recently written a book that she researched very heavily on the food of Spain. And because there's so much history in it, I did find, I looked at that, I even bought it, and I found that really quite inspiring. So that if either the chef or the writer is able to bring a sense of the history and culture to the food they're talking about, to me that makes it much more fascinating. Well,
in the old days, I mean, again, we had all this information from cookery book writers, but I'm talking about the professional restaurant chef. Guys, anybody down there? Are those people important in today's life, the professional restaurant chef? Because they're certainly the stars.
I mean, they're enormously important in people's interest in food. I mean, they're part of the movement, just like all these other things are part of the movement, is to raise the societal appreciation of chefs to a very high level. That didn't used to be the case. I mean, it wasn't always the case that people who cooked in restaurants were looked on as movie stars.
Yeah.
This is a big change. Whether it's a good change or not, I don't know. Oh, Marvin has his hand up, and he's disagreeing with me. Better call on him.
Mm.
All right, so you can ask Marvin more about the book. You can ask Judy more about the Wonderful Oral History Project and these other folks more about what they do. You can ask Jennifer about the collection. You can join us in October when we gather again to celebrate that. And thank you so much all for coming.